Okay, the topic of today's video will be troubleshooting of the right tip tank fuel indication system. This started off as by doing a refill and turning on the master, and we didn't get an indication on the right fuel tip or the right fuel tank on the tip tank. Now I know I put fuel in there, so I would expect it to be reading much higher than below scale on 0. So the very first troubleshooting step in here is we see, well, it shows nothing, but there is a little bit of supporting information when we turn the system initially on. So if the master's off, we see that all the gauges recess below scale to their baseline point. When we first power on the system, we see that generally the gauges respond to their fuel level, and then this one comes off of the base stop up just below the 0. So it tells us initially that that gauge probably has power, but now the troubleshooting begins on why is it not reading a fuel indication. So for this video, we're going to go through and do some basic troubleshooting on potentially why this aircraft, the right tip tank, is non-operative. All right, so part of this process is we're going to try and rule out some basic troubleshooting. So since the gauge was registering some movement but not any real fuel level, we might just peer around inside the tank, see if there's anything obvious. Basically what we'll be looking for here is maybe garbage, that there actually is quantity in the tank, and then perhaps even something as lucky as a float not attached perhaps, and the sender arm is just sunk to the bottom of the tank. But if we look around in there, it's kind of hard to focus, but I can actually see the float arm right there. Try and zoom out a bit, but right there I can see the arm of the sender, and I do not see the float. So what it looks like to me on this particular one is that the arm is sitting at the bottom and just registering essentially an empty tank, but I do not see the float on this tip tank. So it's either in disintegrating to pieces or it's floating around inside the tank. So if that's the case, next thing we're gonna do is drain the fuel out of this tank, at least enough to get the sender out. It's a 17-gallon tank. However, we don't have to drain every little drop out to get the sender out. We'll have to take at least about 12 gallons or so. So we'll start the draining process while we're gonna drain fuel. So we're gonna just probably, you can siphon it out of the wing tank itself, or you can just use the sump drain. Depending on how much time you have, if you drain through here, it'll probably take you about 30 minutes or so to just drain it off. So we'll probably just use this method, save suctioning out of the tank. We'll just drain out of the sump drain into approved receptacles, and then while that's draining, we're gonna go through and take open this panel here to get access to the fuel sender, and then we can start some troubleshooting and repair and replacement of the sender as needed there. At this point, we've drained out about 12 gallons or so of the tank. We've got access to our the back side of our fuel tank through the wingtip, and right here we see the fuel sender. We've got the lead coming off from the gauge assembly. We've got a bonding strap that goes up into the tank, and then we've got another lead going off there. So when we disconnect this, we're gonna just kind of pay attention to the orientation of our hardware. We don't want to take the lead that's going in the center and connect that under a screw head or anything. So we're just gonna orient those properly, and then we'll remove those screws. We'll snip the safeties and we'll pull out the 5 screws, and then pretty much the sender just slides out the back of the tank, and then we can do a little bit of quick troubleshooting on that. We can discuss the fuel sender itself, a little bit of testing of that, and then we'll make way for the overhauled replacement unit to go in instead of this sender that has a fuel float missing. Through the magic of cinema photography, we didn't have to wait on any parts being delivered. Through instantaneous delivery, we have a new fuel sender in hand, and we can start doing the replacement process for this old sender. Now, some points of interest. This is an overhauled unit from was it? Where did I buy it from? Oh yeah, Air Parts of Lock Haven in Pennsylvania, and they carry a lot of fuel system type parts. McFarland makes a replacement for one of these as well. You can buy those new for, I think it's around $400, but there's a several month lead time. I didn't feel like being down for that long again, so I ordered a overhauled one from Air Parts in Lock Haven. Now they will require a core charge of $300 as of the taping of this, or the recording of this video. So make sure you send yours back. Hopefully it's salvageable. Otherwise, you got to pay to wait. This one, they notice they have a connector on there, a knife edge connector, and they install this center conductor, and they don't want you to remove this. That'll void the warranty. So when we remove this, we'll take this part off of the old one and disconnect it to get out. But they want you to make a quick disconnect, so we're gonna have to cut into the OEM harness and add a knife connector, and we'll put some shrink wrap over that so it doesn't contact ground while it's flopping around in the wing. We also have a new gasket. And then while we're doing this, I'll show you a way to check resistance. You can kind of check if your old one's any good or not. We'll compare the old one to the new one. The second part of this, when you get the new, the direct instructions have you check this float. So we're gonna match this float arm up against the original float arm so it kind of sits at the same levels and things like that. They don't want you to bend these tabs here, the stops, there and there. They don't want you bending those from the factory setting. That'll void the warranty as well. I think there's a 6-month warranty. So if you must do it, wait till your warranty's over, right? All right. So let's work on taking out the other one, and then we'll lay it side by side by this, and we'll check the arm arrangement, make sure all that's the same. Here's the back of the sender. We're gonna remove this wire, so that center wire, that goes to the gauge. This is the one that is marked off as don't loosen on the new sender. So what I'm gonna do here is just clip this, and then I'll leave that with her just in case they would be upset that we left that or took that screw out for the core charge. So I'm gonna snip this here, and we're gonna crimp on a new knife edge connector on this wire. That's the OEM wire. And then these other ones we'll loosen, we'll snip the safeties, we'll pull out those screws, and then we'll pull the sender out through this hole. So I'm just gonna start by clipping this lead off. I'll clip it close to it because, you know, why get rid of excess wire? Now this one we're gonna knife edge with a new connector later, so we're just gonna set that one aside. And then the other ones I'm gonna keep connected because I wanna leave the original connectors on there, so I'm not gonna snip those. We're gonna leave those terminals on there, but we can snip our safeties. I'll snip them, and then I'll fast forward to zip through it. Just to ease removal, I'm not going to take the safeties off now. I'll pull the hardware off, and then I'll take the safeties off the hardware later. And then we'll do this till all of them are out. Then we'll just slide the assembly out the hole, real gentle. And then we can clean this hole up in preparation for installation. We can reconnect and then we can trim our cable and put the knife edge splice on for the new one. On a comparative test, so this is the new sender on the left. When I pulled out the float, or the sender assembly, the float was disconnected, so that's probably going to explain the reasoning for the zero fuel sender problem. Remember earlier in the video we saw that the lift arm was actually sitting on the bottom of the tank, so that just confirmed. We did find the float, appears to be all in one piece, but the hole that the float arm sits on has been wallowed out over the years, so I guess that just wallowed off enough and floated away and no longer worked. But for comparison, you know, so I believe the sender itself is okay, it's just the float is gone. But if we're going to test this from a functional standpoint, just for comparison, we can use the new one. So what we'll do is connect a lead from our center electrode there to the ground through the ohm meter. Make sure you're on ohms. And then basically you can go through the sweep. So a full tank, an empty tank. So an empty tank's showing 243 ohms, give or take. Full tank, for the most part, 31, give or take. Now we can switch senders. I'll just clip the leads here onto this one. Just for comparison, this one at full, showing 41, 39 ohms, so in the similar vicinity. And then full empty, 246. So the senders aren't that far off of each other, but clearly the float being disconnected is the reason that this one was inoperative. So now we got the new one. We're going to go through and reinstall this one. I forgot to mention that before we put the new one in, we want to make sure that it wasn't damaged during shipping. The big concern there is that our arms of the floats are sitting in relative to the same position. So we'll basically look down, and that's a weird angle, I know, but we'll make sure that those arms kind of sit in the same position in full and empty. If we need to, we can bend the arm to match the old one. We don't want to bend these tabs, that'll void the warranty. So that's the last thing, is just make sure the arms are sitting in the same position as the original ones to compensate for your float settings for your fuel tank level. Preparing the flange side hole for the installation, we'll want to clean off all this excess sealant that may have been used. Looks like maybe it leaked at some point and they tried to put excess stuff in there. For the most part, I've learned that these gaskets, as long as this surface is clean, usually can be snugged and tightened in the dry position and usually don't cause much problem. The tip tank especially, because there's not much head pressure pushing on the gasket itself. If you look in the service data, there's not really any formal procedures for installing or removing these. So we'll basically just use the 4313 generic torque charts for the screw settings. It's real loose, it's like 40 inch-pounds or something, but we'll look that up. But we'll clean this off with a razor blade. Now note, you can actually see the fuel level here because the tank's somewhat transparent with the fiberglass, so you can obviously see that it's below that hole. The trade-off of this is if we're messy or sloppy with this cleaning job, we can get contaminants down in the tank, and then we got to worry about that stuff getting into the fuel delivery line. So you know, best practice would probably be to drain the tank afterwards, flush the tank, make sure any particulates are out, and clean that way. Or take some precautions to make sure you're not a dirty, sloppy mess as you do this. So let's get to cleaning that off. Now we got the hole scraped off just using a razor blade. I take a little soapy water to clean the hole off. Now we can install a fresh gasket, install the screws, make our final connections, and torque the sender. All right, now we can put our sender back in. I start the sender gasket and the screws, just kind of slowly feed that in that hole. You have to angle it a couple times or different ways to get it to slide through there. And then I like to just start the gasket. It is keyed a little bit. All the holes aren't the same distance apart. There's one side that's a little bit longer. I like to start a few of them, just kind of hold that gasket in place. I left these two out because those are our connections there, so we'll put those in a minute. We just kind of feed that up in there, line up a couple of screw holes, and you can start turning those down. Start making our other connections with our ground straps. Find our other screw. Where's that piece? It's right there. The screws had a lock nut on them, or lock washer, and they also get safetied, so we're just gonna do the same thing going back in with them. All right, now that I got all these screws started, I'm gonna get a screwdriver in here. I'll cut the video for that, and we'll snug all those down. We'll torque them to the torque chart specs, and then we'll reconnect our lead here, and then we can fill it and do an ops check. All right, we have these screws installed. We've got our connections for our grounds, and then we've got our center connector ready to go for the new one. I just followed the torque in the 4313, which it's a 1032 size screw, so that was like 20-25 inch-pounds. Basically, when you start torquing that, the gasket starts, you can see it kind of coming out the side, so that's usually about the right torque. So next thing we'll do is we'll go through and we'll safety these. It's probably one of the longer parts of this process, is safety and all that. And then we'll take our new connector, we'll connect our knife connector, and we'll put a piece of shrink tube over this, just to keep the connection from touching something else while it's wired up in here. So next shot, we'll have the safeties on and connect the wire. Actually, before we safety everything, I'm gonna fill the tank, make sure those don't leak. You know, that way if something's wrong, we can readjust the torque or as needed to keep it from leaking. Prior to filling it, I'm gonna pull the sump and then just flush fresh gas through the tank itself to just kind of rinse out any little gribblies that may have fell down behind the tank during the installation. You know, we don't want to pull any contaminants into our fuel system. So I'm going to flush the tank, and then I'm going to fill the tank, and then we'll do a leak check first before we safety and connect everything. So here we'll connect our knife edge connector. We'll put a piece of protection over that electrical joint. And then we'll start filling. I'm going to start filling. So I flushed it. I'm going to start filling the tank up, and then occasionally we'll go check the quantity we put in and just compare it to the gauge in the cockpit. Just give you some idea of how accurate your gauge is. But so basically we can do that now. So after I connect that and fill it, then we'll do the safeties at the very end once we're happy with the electrical or the fluid connection. Let's put a knife edge connector there. Pull this mil-spec wire wrap around it. And then I'll put a couple zip ties on this just to hold that. Not that it's going to bounce around and rub into anything, but we just don't want it to. that on the ends there. Clip off our excess so it doesn't gore our hands. Alright, so now electrically it should function even though we haven't safetied it yet. At this point we'll start filling the tank and we'll compare quantity put in versus quantity indicated. Now for example, I put in 5 gallons to the tip tank. Here's the right tip tank we're working on, and it's showing just a needle width below 5 gallons. In the Piper manual there's a chart showing, you know, what's kind of an acceptable range for each increment, so you can always compare that to the service manual. And just another checkup, I've put 17 gallons in now and the needle's sitting right where it should be, so there's probably about 1 inch of expansion room in that tank on top of the fuel level at 17 gallons, just for comparison purposes, so you can know how much fuel you got. How accurate is it? If the numbers were way off, you could change the float arm settings, you know, bend the float to change the level, and then some of these gauges have adjustments. If it's out of tolerance, you can tweak those a little bit. But that's all straight in the service manual. At this point, we have our safeties installed for our fuel sender. We've got all our wires connected and tied back. At this point, we can also close up our panel and get ready to go flying.